Hello, I'm Zonalfear and I like to test PC components. For those of you who have watched my videos, there has been something noticeable in a lot of them. They're often AMD focused. This actually isn't intentional or by design. When I'm not making videos, I'm playing games, and often this is on AMD hardware, as these are the processors that have fit in my budget for the performance that I want. This has naturally created a slight leaning in my videos, one that I seek to correct today. For my daily use, I currently use two AMD based PCs, one featuring a Ryzen 7 5700X3D and the other a Ryzen 2400G that I mostly use for video capture and editing, with some light gaming when the urge arises. They're both very competent PCs, but both of them aren't Intel. I always try to be unbiased, so in the interest of fairness I have made a change. My upstairs PC is now an Intel based machine. I sold the parts from my 2400G PC and put it towards a modern Intel socket so that I can get a feel of what Intel's latest processors are like. After overthinking this for days, I eventually settled on an Intel Core i3 processor on the modern LGA 1700 socket. Wanting to keep my costs down, I opted to go for a DDR4 base motherboard, but the CPU itself features quite modern feature support for one of Intel's budget processors, which gives the Intel a one-up straight out of the box, as usually this support on AMD lies behind much more expensive processors. So, what did I get? I bought the Raptor Lake Intel Core i3 14100F for £72, a quad-core processor in a more-cores world. The 14100F feature set is actually quite impressive for the lower end of Intel's offerings. It features both DDR5 and PCIe 5 support, and the processor itself features 4 cores with hyperthreading, resulting in 8 total threads available, clocked in at a decent 3.5 GHz. Featuring a generous 12 megs of L3 cache and boosting up to a frankly obscene 4.7 GHz when the processor's thermal management allows, this is a remarkably well-featured processor for its asking price. The F in the name indicates that this processor has no onboard graphics, but that's not going to be an issue as I use dedicated cards for video display and save myself £30 by buying the F variant of this processor. This 14100F replaces my previous Ryzen 2400G, but outside of the CPU and motherboard change, my PC remains entirely the same outside of this. Compared to the 14100F, Ryzen 2400G is significantly weaker in both its feature set and per core performance, so this should be a significant uplift in gaming. And before we get on to the gaming, I just want to speak about the single biggest issue I have had with the 14100F. LGA 1700 has earned a reputation for running very hot, and in my testing today, that reputation is well deserved. Temperatures on Intel's stock cooler were so high that I ended up buying an aftermarket cooler and contact plate, something I've never had to do with other processors before. From the outset, I have been left unimpressed with the stock cooler's performance and would highly recommend you pair anything based on socket 1700 with an aftermarket cooler and a contact plate to keep those temperatures in check. Anyway, here are the specs of the machine we'll be using today. As I mentioned before, this is identical outside of the CPU platform to my previous build. Everything that was in my machine before is still in my machine, making the only difference in performance the Core i3 14100F today. Okay, let's get started. First up, as always, is Fallout 4. At 1080p high with textures set to ultra, the i3 delivered an absolutely solid experience that did not budge from the game's 60 FPS lock in my Sanctuary to Concord run. After reviewing the 20 minutes of video footage that I had on this, I noticed that the i3 didn't seem to drop a single frame in my playtime, already one-upping my old Ryzen 2400G. This is an excellent start here. Red Dead 2 is next. At 1080p medium, the 14100F delivered similar performance to the 2400G, but this was to be expected as it is the RX 580 that is the bottleneck here. Comparing this footage directly with the 2400G, the Core i3 just about pips it to the post with a more consistent frame rate that mostly stayed at that 60 FPS mark, with generally lower CPU usage to boot, meaning that we have more processor here to play with if we want to add a much more powerful dedicated card in future. The Division 2 now. If you watch my 2400G video, you'll recall that the Division 2 had significant performance issues that I just couldn't shake from the Ryzen. Frequent stuttering and a middling frame rate dogged my playtime on my old processor, to the point that it was borderline unplayable. Well, step in the Core i3 14100F. At 1080p and medium settings, the i3 delivers an incredible performance that is night and day better than the 2400G. With a frame rate well above 70 FPS in my playtime, this was a fantastic experience. Don't write quad cores off just yet, because this one still has a lot of grunt. Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced makes its first appearance on the bench. At 1080p very high, we were once again treated to a smooth experience on the 14100F. With an average frame rate of 71 FPS in my half hour or so of gaming, the comparative result with the 2400G's Legacy Edition isn't even close. The 14100F performed better at higher quality settings than the 2400G, and it did this at double the frame rate of the Ryzen 2. You're going to have a great time on the i3, even with an older card like the RX 580. Borderlands 2 was another triumph for the 14100F. At 1080p very high, the Core i3 once again easily doubled the frame rate compared to the 2400G. The game was faster and smoother on the i3, with a frame rate that held mostly in the 170s. It wasn't even close. I do think that Borderlands 2 favours Intel processors as they often deliver better results compared to their AMD counterparts, but this was a staggering uplift in performance over the 2400G from a couple of weeks back. Starfield's also making its first appearance on the bench today. At 1080p and using the low preset, both the i3 and the RX 580 did a stellar job here. Outdoor areas were certainly more taxing and saw a 50 FPS average frame rate, but indoors would see performance rocket above the 60 FPS mark. It ran better than my own expectations going in, so this is going to be a great experience if you have similar hardware. And yes, I meant those puns, both of them. The incredible Dead Space remake was a winner too. At 1080p and using the auto option, Dead Space managed a mostly 60 FPS or so experience, with occasional dips into the low 50s in more wide open areas. It actually ran really well here, and I ended up playing for about an hour because I found myself getting off track and just having a good time. It's an excellent game and a solid performer on the Core i3. Payday 2 was an easy one for the 14100F. Launching with a modern CPU support option turned on, the i3 hit well above the 60 FPS I'd say was needed for a decent experience. Even better, Payday 2 hit what I think might have been an engine frame rate limit of 200 FPS repeatedly, so whichever frame rate you prefer to play at, the Core i3 is going to deliver it. Unfortunately, I don't have any comparative footage from the 2400G, but I play Payday 2 a fair bit and you'll have to take my word on it that the Core i3 gives Payday 2 quite the performance uplift against the 2400G. Avowed impressed with its performance on the RX 580. At 1080p using the low preset and balanced rendering, the RX 580 managed to deliver a 30 to 40 FPS result on this new 2025 title. While the overall numbers might not look high, the RX 580 is an 8-year-old card that is still relevant today. The Core i3 had no issues keeping up with the RX 580, and overall this was a pretty good result for what is budget hardware. Space Marine 2 was a similar story. I deliberately chose a very heavy section of the game to play here, as I wanted to really stress the Core i3. At 1080p low and once again using the balanced rendering option, we saw a 40 FPS or so return overall, with dips into the low 30s not uncommon when things get really, buggy. Less intense moments will see higher frame rates, and overall you're going to have a pretty good time on this combination. PUBG ran considerably better on the Core i3 this time around. At 1080p medium, the 14100F easily delivered a much faster, more consistent result than the Ryzen 2400G. Max, average and minimum frame rates were all significantly better this time around, leading to an overall much better experience. Average frame rates were in the 80s, but it wasn't unusual to see 3-digit returns, especially in indoor areas. Sniper Elite 3 ran great. At 1080p with maxed out everything, the Core i3 managed an average frame rate well into the 150s, and we often hit the 200 FPS engine limit here too. It ran remarkably well, with absolutely no issues in my playtime with it. As a side note, I will be phasing some of these older games out of the testing suite when I'm testing newer hardware like this in future. Dead Island Definitive Edition is another similar story. Well into 3 digits here, the Core i3 had no problems powering past 110 FPS in gameplay. RX5 usage was 100% here, but while the Core i3 still had a little more to give, we're definitely GPU bound in this test, and a couple of other games tested today were also GPU bound upon reviewing the footage. Watch Dogs 2 was a decent experience. At 1080p and using the game's high preset, we saw a just about 60 FPS average, with frequent dips into the low 50s while traversing San Francisco. There were no particular performance problems to report, but that frame rate would drop into the 50s very frequently. Overall, it was a pretty good performer, and you can quite easily play like this. And finally today, The Witcher 3. Using the DX12 mode at 1080p with the game set to its high preset, we were once again just about at a 60 FPS experience. Similar to Watch Dogs 2, there were frequent dips into the 50s, but nothing that would take you out at the moment, and I was pretty pleased with this level of performance. with the RX 580 being the limiting factor here once again. The Core i3 itself performed fantastically. Okay, and that's a wrap today. So, my first week with the Core i3 14100F. How do I feel about it? Well, there's a lot to like about it. With modern feature support for PCIe 5, a feature usually reserved for well above its price range, the Core i3 has a lot of headroom for future upgrades when I get around to it. At just £72, it offers superb performance and in some instances matches Intel's fairly recent 6-core offerings, which is quite frankly incredible when you think about the fact that the Core i3 has a 2-core deficit. Best of all is that this kind of performance was achieved by just using all parts from my previous 2400G PC. So in reality, some parts of this setup today, well, perfectly fine for the 2400G, are suboptimal for the 14100F, so that any future upgrades I make should improve this performance considerably. Gaming was a great overall experience on the Core i3 over the Ryzen 2400G. Games were smoother, hit higher frame rates, and there's even plenty of scope on a lot of the games tested today to bump up the quality settings further, so you'll have a visually better experience too. Daily tasks were absolutely no bother, and the Core i3 was snappy in general usage. I don't focus on raw CPU performance generally, but I will start to include some CPU metrics in my testing going forwards, in this case using Cinebench. The Core i3's Cinebench R15 score was 1291 CB, but I don't yet have any other comparative data of my own to compare it to. This is a pretty decent number though. My only real downsides here is that these things do run hot. You'll want to buy a contact plate and aftermarket cooler for anything on LGA 1700, which adds another 20 quid to the price. And I really do feel that this is an essential rather than an optional purchase after using the stock cooler first too. It is, perhaps unsurprisingly, much more power hungry than the 2400G despite them both being 65 watt processors. The Ryzen processors have shown themselves to be remarkably energy efficient, whereas the Core i3 14100F easily consumed double the power in comparison, no doubt influenced by the fact that the 14100F just wants to boost all the time for any reason. Obviously, the boosting clocks grants a massive boost in performance, but this is also where the higher power consumption is coming from. In fact, after reviewing the footage again in editing, I only saw a couple of occasions where the 14100F wasn't boosting. It spent the entire time at the all-core boost of 4.5 GHz in my gaming with it. It's just constantly at those higher clocks, giving you the best performance it can, and in gaming, that is what matters. My only other reservation is that even at £72, the Core i3 14100F starts to be in the ballpark range of some AM4 6-core processors such as the Ryzen 5 5600, which is the better processor overall, so you really have to find the Core i3 for the right price. Especially as you'll get more premium features from a B550 motherboard at again similar prices to the H610M motherboard I'm using today. You will miss out on the support of DDR5 and PCIe 5 that LGA 1700 offers over the AM4 platform though. It's a tricky one to balance at this pricing. AM4 will give you overall better performance for similar money, but that socket is now end of life and it doesn't have some of the newer support that LGA 1700 processors have. So while you may get better immediate performance for the money, LGA 1700 is an investment into the future in this regard. Overall though, the Core i3 14100F is an excellent quad-core processor that proves that quad-core processors aren't quite done yet. Find it for the right price and it will be a capable gaming processor that will deliver excellent results for those of you on a budget and buying Intel. I've been Xenofair and Houndlander Gaming, and thanks for watching the Intel Core i3 14100F. Until next time, bye bye. Got time to bleed, I'll break through the scars. As the light stars, I'll give you stars.